Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Way the World Works. Today, we are celebrating a very, very happy birthday or anniversary to the Bill of Rights. So we're going to talk about that today. Now, remember, we film and record these episodes a little bit before they air. And this might not air exactly on the date. It might air a few days before, a few days after. But so let's talk about the actual date. The Bill of Rights was ratified on December 15th, 1791. So it's an old guy. It's an old document. And let's talk about it because here's what's interesting. People always forget that, the Constitution was already being deliberated, already being discussed. And so a lot of people think, why would the founders or the framers actually, because remember, we call those who designed or helped create the Constitution, they are the framers, where the founders were the ones who founded the country and signed the Declaration, were involved in the Second Continental Congress, or some of them, even like the people who were helping spread the word about it, right? We call them founders. Now, there are a lot of crossover. There's a lot of founders and framers. So just side note, so the framers, why did they write an entire Constitution but leave out all these rights that we talk about the most, like free speech, privacy, fair trials, jury trials, all those things? Why did they leave them out? Did they just forget? No. So the Bill of Rights was not an afterthought, right? It was not something where they're like, oops, we forgot it. Hurry, let's write it in. It's something that was actually argued about, debated over. It was a big deal, actually. So we're going to talk about that. So first, you probably do know what the Bill of Rights is, but let's go over it just in case. The Bill of Rights, there are going to be those 10 amendments that were kind of a addition. If you send an email and you send an attachment, it was like an attachment to the original Constitution, where it's, free speech, right to bear arms, no quartering of soldiers, privacy, all these good things we talk about. And we've done episodes where I've gone over a lot of these amendments, and we will go over at some point all of them, but I like to, spice it up, keep you on your toes. So we will go over all of them at some point, but I like to do full episodes on each one just because they're so important and there's so much good stuff in there. So let's talk about it in terms of the constitutional ratification. And without the Bill of Rights, the Constitution and having it be adopted as our law of the land almost fell apart because there were people who felt so passionately that it should be included and people who felt so passionately that it should not. Now, we have the Federalists and the anti-Feds, right? The Federalists are those who believed that we needed to have this stronger central government, and the anti-Feds were those who thought, no, you're not going to be able to limit it. You can say we'll have this limited government where you have this central authority, but we'll limit it. But, history has shown us that doesn't work. Now, everybody realized to some extent that the Articles of Confederation were also not working, but the anti-Feds wanted to see something still a little looser than the Constitution. And again, they had really good reason for that. I think both sides had excellent points. Now, there are two phrases that you see in the Constitution that made the anti-Feds really nervous, and that was general welfare and necessary and proper. Now, why would these make the anti-Feds nervous? And let me tell you, because the way the Constitution is written, and this is still up for debate today, these two phrases get debated all the time, is that it basically said the government could do things that were in the general welfare of the public, of the people, for the general welfare of the public, or the people rather, or anything that was necessary and proper to the ends of the delegated authority that was given to them in the Constitution. Now, these are very broad terms. What does general welfare mean? Exactly. Nobody really knows. And that's something that is debated today. I might think general welfare means protecting people from excessive taxation, right? Somebody else might think general welfare is making sure everyone has health care, So these terms are, even though the founders probably had, or the framers had a really good idea of what they meant by this then, I don't think it dawned to them how much that was going to get twisted later on, which we see now. And then necessary and proper. This also gets abused all the time because the government will say, okay, well, I think I should do this thing that isn't technically constitutional because it's necessary and proper to this thing that is constitutional. And so these things are very real fears for the anti-federalists, who I think were really good at seeing ahead and seeing what could happen. And I think a lot of the Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton, either couldn't or actually kind of wanted the loopholes to meet their own ends, because Alexander Hamilton was very ambitious. And remember, I said that's not always a bad thing. I did a whole episode on him, so go back and listen to that one. But we're going to talk about him in a minute as well. We'll pause there, though, and get to Hamilton again later. All right, so it comes time to ratify. That means officially adopt the Constitution. And a lot of the states do it very quickly, except for three. But the three are the big ones. All right, Massachusetts, which, I mean, the country was in many ways, they call, Boston and the Massachusetts area the cradle of liberty, because that is where a lot of this stuff went down. Tea Party, you have Sam Adams, you have John Adams. Like, Massachusetts was a big part of the American Revolution. And then you have Virginia, also a big part. You had people like Thomas Jefferson. You have James Madison, who we're going to talk about in a minute, who is known now as the father of the Constitution, and you'll see why also in a minute. And then you have New York. These are big states, lots of people living in them. And their message was clear. They were saying, if there's no Bill of Rights, then we are not going to sign on to this Constitution. And fun fact, one of the people who was most vocal about that was Patrick Henry, who was my favorite orator, or your speech. He would give speeches, and you might know his most famous one, which was the "Give me liberty or give me death," which I get chills hearing even to this day. So that was a big thing to them, right? They're saying, absolutely not. We need a Bill of Rights that's actually saying, like, no, government, these are some things you absolutely cannot do. So they refused to ratify unless there were these changes. And again, they had really good reason for this, because remember, they're looking at this and they're saying, no, we need a safety net. We need something to protect us if the federal government does get too big and too bold for us to stop. And again, they had really good reason. They had history showing them that this could happen. Remember that Britain had an English Bill of Rights, and still the king didn't always obey that. And so they're coming at this from a historical standpoint with very valid points. And this turns into a whole thing. And you're going to have John Hancock, who you guys remember. So you might hear the phrase like, give me your John Hancock, which is give me your signature, because he was the first one to sign the Declaration and he signed it the biggest. So when you look at the Declaration, John Hancock kind of stands out there. I don't think he meant to. Imagine the pressure of being the first person to sign. And you're like, do I sign little? Do I sign big? And he went big and bold. So John Hancock is also a Bostonian. Remember, I said a lot of big players come from Massachusetts and Boston particularly. And he's a big leader, and he steps up, and he obviously did not trust this big central government either. And so he offered a deal. He said, listen, Massachusetts will ratify the Constitution if Congress promised a Bill of Rights as its very first job. Like, sign the Constitution while the ink is still drying. I want us to start working on a Bill of Rights immediately. And so he was like, basically, like, we'll sign if was essentially what he's saying. And so Massachusetts is like, yep, let's get on board with this. And Virginia and New York hear this, and they're like, all right, yeah, okay, we can get on board with this. We will sign on for the Constitution. We will ratify it. But yeah, we need this Bill of Rights. Absolutely. If you have the American history book, the Tuttle Twins American History book, the second volume, there's a great section at the very end of the book, actually. So a spoiler, turn to the end. I won't give you all the details, right? Don't want to spoil the story. But Grandma Tuttle explains this really perfectly, because she basically says the federal government has checks and balances, which we've talked about before. And the Bill of Rights gives the states and the people the ultimate check, just in case, right? Because the Constitution's checks and balances, those are within the three branches of government. The judicial can't get any more powerful than the legislative and the executive, because there's these checks, and that goes for the executive and the legislative, right? That's great. And we love that. That actually, the separation of powers is what keeps our government honest as much as it can. But the people need a check, and the Bill of Rights gives them that check. It says absolutely not can you try to weasel your way into violating these 10 very, very important rights, right? Because politicians will do whatever the people let them do. That is the sad reality of it. And you know what? We saw that during COVID. A lot of people gave into fear, and they let the government do whatever it wanted to do. And I would like to believe that if it were to happen again today, it would not be that way, but we'll see. So, all right. So the people, these are the delegates of the Constitutional Convention. So they decided to do this list of protections that could never be erased. Enter James Madison, who is such an important guy. In fact, I made it one of my New Year's resolutions for this upcoming year to read as much as I can about him, because he's just such a fascinating figure. So part of the reason he's called the father of the Constitution is, well, twofold. One, he was one of the primary authors of the Federalist Papers, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. But he also takes on this burden of writing the Bill of Rights. And so he is getting ideas from everybody. He gets 200 ideas from the states and the citizens, because if there's one thing, if you start asking for public feedback, you're going to get it, and it's going to be a lot. So I do not envy him for taking on this project. So he boils them down to 19 proposals, which is a lot. House approves 17 of those proposals, and then the Senate trimmed it to 12. And then finally, 10 were ratified as the states. That's how we get them. This took 2.5 years, but the Bill of Rights finally became law on December 15th, 1791. So what do these amendments actually look like? Well, let's talk about it in terms of what we talk about in the second Tuttle Twins history book, American history book, where Fred calls it, a treasure chest. And so let's go through what he says there. And again, I'm not going to dive into these in detail because that's why we have the individual episodes. But so let me just go through it quickly. So in the book, there's a Bible in the chest. What does the Bible represent? Does it say everybody has to be religious? No, it is quite the opposite. It is a symbol of free speech and free expression and free religion and free assembly, right? That is the First Amendment. So he tells them that the Bible is a representation of what that means, right? People shared their ideas in pamphlets and taverns and churches and town meetings during the Revolution, and the Crown tried to squash that. And so it's so important. And so obviously the framers, or, technically James Madison, but they all voted on these, put this together. Second Amendment, and goodness knows they probably did not know that this was going to turn into such a controversial issue hundreds of years later. But so Fred reminds them when he shows them that he has chestnuts. Why chestnuts? Well, if the colonists lost their guns, chestnuts meaning like throwing them. So it's supposed to be like weapons. If the colonists lost their guns, they would never have become free. So this is the right to bear arms, that you need to have weapons, that people should be allowed to have weapons, not necessarily even to protect from burglars, though that is important too, self-defense, but to protect them in case their government got too big. This is huge, right? The militias, these Minutemen, these people that were just people in the town that would get together and protect their town, that is largely, what contributed to the revolution. And even though there was a Continental Army, the militias played a big role. Third Amendment, there's a red coat uniform in the treasure chest and a map, and that is because it means no quartering of soldiers. What does that mean? That means that colonists in the pre-revolution days, they were forced to house and feed British soldiers under the Quartering Act. And we might think this is silly now, but the Third Amendment still exists for a reason. And it says, no, you don't have to house soldiers in your house. Absolutely not. Fourth Amendment, there's I think it's a gavel in the history book, and this ties back to, the British Bill of Rights, which is, remember I told you they had one too, and they had one for a reason, and that's kings weren't allowed to invade homes or seize property without cause, and that is this Fourth Amendment. It's no searches, improper searches or seizures. You have to have a warrant. Fifth Amendment, that's going to be due process, and the gavel kind of represented, I think it was 4, 5, and 6 in the book. But so it's also going to stand for due process. That is that the government has to follow certain rules before they can, convict you of a crime. You have these rules you have to follow, and that makes sure that government does everything correct. Fair trial, that's a Sixth Amendment. Speedy trial with a lawyer, public proceedings. Seventh Amendment, I talk about this one a lot. That is the right to a jury trial. Eighth Amendment, this is important too because this is no excessive bail, no cruel punishments, no excessive fines. And we're going to dive into this a little bit soon because I've been on a real Eighth Amendment kick lately. And then one of the other items in the treasure chest for the Ninth Amendment was a telescope. Why on earth? Do we all have a right to a telescope? No. But why do we have the telescope? Because it reminds us that you have more than the rights that are written down. So you can see them right in front of you. But if you look up, you still have more rights. So the fear of those who didn't want to put the Bill of Rights into the amendment was that they were like, well, why, if we put this in, the government is going to think that they only have to abide by these rights and there's not more rights. And so there was this, which does make sense if you think about it, because to them, they're thinking we just want a war against an oppressive government. Why would anyone try to do this? But history has proven people forget or they ignore. So the Ninth Amendment basically says that the federal government has to abide by these 10 rights. These are 10 non-negotiable rights, but these aren't the end all be all. There are other rights. We're just putting these down because we find them particularly important, but there's still a host, a multitude of other rights to be protected. Then we have the 10th Amendment, and this one's really important because this one is about states' rights. Okay, so we're saying what it says is basically the federal government only has the powers listed. The federal government, the Constitution is really saying what you can do and nothing else, right? That's supposed to be what it is. That this is the government's proper role. full stop. Okay. But what that also means is that everything else is with the states. The federal government can only do this, but the states have the right to do other things. So later, the 14th Amendment is going to kind of tie into the 10th Amendment and make sure. So after the 10th Amendment is ratified, it did not hold states accountable to the Bill of Rights. So you're going to see states try to get away with infringing on these very important rights. So later on, much later on, the 14th Amendment is going to come around and it's going to say, oh, actually, states, you have to obey the Bill of Rights, which is going to be really interesting. So like most things, it is not going to take long before the government tries to break its own rules. And guess who's one of the first people to do it? That's right, Mr. Alexander Hamilton, when he is going to try to do this whole national bank and say it's part of the necessary and proper clause. So Hamilton's such a fascinating person because he's so smart and he's contributed so much, but he's also a little bit of a weasel on a snake when it comes to trying to further his own ambitions and wants and needs. So again, even with all these protections, I think the anti-feds are really proven correct because you're already going to see the government and people in the government trying to abuse these powers. So Bill of Rights, absolutely important. It's funny because we think of these now as such a, again, non-negotiable when it comes to our government and our Constitution, but it was up for debate. And so just to kind of wrap that up again, anti-feds wanted it because they're saying, no, the government, we can limit it as much as we want with the Constitution. It's still going to try to trample on our rights. So let's at least solidify these 10 very important ones, understanding that under the 9th Amendment, this is not all of them. There's still more rights. And the Federalists are saying like, yeah, but if we do that, they're going to think these are the only rights. And so there's this back and forth. Both have some good points. Ultimately, anti-feds are like, we will ratify the Constitution if you allow us to have the Bill of Rights. James Madison takes on this whole big responsibility, ratifies them. And so December 15th is the anniversary. And I think it's so important. I encourage you as a family to talk about the debate over the Bill of Rights and if you think the Federalists have better points or the anti-feds and you know, maybe in your family, you could even make your own Bill of Rights. That could be fun. So there's a lot of lessons to take from this, but I tend to believe that including the Bill of Rights was a smart move. I think the anti-feds have a lot of really good points. They don't always get credit for them, but I think the Bill of Rights was vital to protecting our very sacred rights and our unalienable rights, as they are called in the Declaration. So we will leave it there, guys. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the podcast and share with your friends and your family. And until next time, I will talk to you later.